So welcome everybody to week 10. We've made it to the last week of the experiential process. So amazing job for getting here. This is no small feat to commit to this and to move through this and just to have the discipline really so well done for being here, however you manage it, just really showing up for yourself. It's really great. So this week is one of my favorite weeks. I love moving into consciously entering into the unified field after a lot of clearing, after a lot of allowing the integration. And we might still feel that the integration is going on, but we're starting to consciously move into more of an understanding of the wider web. And he starts off this chapter by saying, what we seek, we find, and what we ask for, we receive. And sometimes this can be a bit hard to get our heads around, but really it's just saying that we are getting what we want all the time, even though we don't always feel like it. And we're getting what we want because we're unconsciously asking. We're unconsciously asking from our imprints that have happened in our childhoods, the things that have happened and stayed in our systems. We're unconsciously seeking answers, and life is bringing them in the form of messengers and different circumstances. So we're always getting what we're looking for, but it doesn't always feel that way. And it's always moving us towards evolution. It's always moving us towards growth. But it's always a reflection outside of what's going on inside. It's a very good mirror when we look around. It's an accurate, complete mirror. So he says, if we look beyond the surface and we just go into our bodies and into our energetic field and just look at the energy, look at what's happening energetically, all those imprints that aren't digested, which are just the unresolved emotions, will be the exact circumstances going on in our lives or whatever's happening to us. They'll be a mirror. So if we want to understand where we are, we can look out and look in and know that they're one and the same. So they're a precise match. And if something's not in harmony, we know that we don't need to go and rearrange the furniture outside of us. We don't need to change that person or that circumstance, although we may decide to. We know it's not the root. So it's the effect and it's not the cause. So in order to get deeper, we have to get off the circumstances and the behaviors and the whatever is happening out in the transfixing reality of our lives and just come into, how do I feel about this? What's the resonance? And the stories will separate us from the whole. All the mental ideas that will keep us in a state of separation, that will keep us in a place of not resolving, and we'll stay in reactivity. And it's very tempting because we've got very good at using our minds and trying to make meaning and have significance. But we also just really want to remember we can come back to our bodies, come back to the feeling, come back to holding space for those feelings. And eventually they will integrate. It's not easy. We know that going through intense, heavy charges is hard work. But once we do and we sit with them, they'll resolve. And if we take responsibility and we can do time travel meditations and do some work of how does this come back to me, we are clearing. So he talks this week about the gap. And the gap is really, if we look at each other here, it's the distance between what we perceive we are here as an individual in a body and looking at each other. And then it's looking at the things that are around you right now, the cup that's here, the items that are around us. That is what he's calling the gap. The gap's between anything between us and anything. And whatever distance we're perceiving in that gap, like if we're like, this is a cup, that is another person. If we're staying in a very mattered-based universe where that's your body, that's my body, we are opening the gap and we are coming further away from presence. So it's like, if we close the gap, we get closer to presence. And that's by realizing that on some very deep intrinsic level, we are in one unified field. We're sharing one body, our senses, our thoughts, they don't end here, that we have a unified interconnectivity. And that's part of the one vibration. We have a very, seemingly solid body, but even science is showing that this is made up of 99.9% energy, and we're all part of the same collective energy field. So it makes sense in terms of quantum physics. We know that we're part of one unified field of awareness. Now, we know also that we are so interconnected that it's beyond interconnected. We are part of, at one with. If we just look at a tree wouldn't be able to stand without the earth. A tree wouldn't be able to survive without all the nutrients, and then it wouldn't be able to survive without the oxygen, the sun, without the rain. All of the life that is around this tree is what makes the tree possible. The tree could lose a branch, that's what we're calling a tree, and it would still be the tree. But if you took away the sun, there would be no tree. So what is more tree, the branch or the sun? And this is the same for us. We are so interconnected and interdependent on absolutely everything that, you could take away our little finger and that wouldn't be very pleasant, but we would survive. And if you took away the oxygen that we're breathing, we wouldn't last a minute. So what is more us, our little finger or breath of oxygen? We are part of a unified collective web. It's, it's on a sort of material level, it makes sense. We are everything. And we wouldn't survive without obviously drinking and eating. At what point, what point do we start and life, the greater life begin? It's one. So this is what this chapter is really expressing, is that there's a unified field, there's a unified experience, and our little minds find it quite hard to grasp the enormity of that. And we're not also conditioned to, I'm just going to press mute. We're also not conditioned to looking at ourselves as this interconnected being. We're not brought up in that way to really respect the beingness of all of life. But we have little glimpses of these unified experiences in our lives. We might be thinking of someone and they call, we thought of someone and then we bump into them. There's someone mentions a book 3 times in a week that we should read, just all sorts of odd things that we feel like somehow it's intuition, it's empathy, it's telepathy, whatever we want to call it. It's somehow, it feels like there's, wow, how did think something in here get out into the wider web of life? And it's because it's like the air we breathe, it's all absolutely, connected and intrinsically one with all of us. So the thing with Michael Brown is that he says that we shouldn't talk about this. so he says that when you do talk about these things, that you start to separate, you close the gap, he believes, because when you start to talk about it, things being one, then somehow we all know that, and then we're sort of somehow separating ourselves by expressing this. He writes about it in the book. I think that, it's written, and I think personally, I think it is helpful to have guidelines. Obviously, the most powerful way of really comprehending this is to be around people that are embodying this more and more, so that consciousness starts to infuse within us. So he's saying this week to look for evidence, not just now, but always look for evidence. If you want to keep a journal of looking for unified experiences, I think that's a beautiful thing to do, because we are keeping ourselves in a state of really acknowledging that we're so much more than this individual self. And we're saying, let me see expressions of oneness in my life, and let me appreciate them, and let me acknowledge them, and let me hold them, and crystallize that understanding within us. So he really talks about, we are feeling the same thing as beings. We're feeling the same emotions. We're sort of all, we're all feeling it. But when we start to put it through our filters of belief and our filters of narratives, then we start to feel that we're separate. So he's saying it's best not to get into too much story, to tell too much about, and just to understand that we are experiencing the same thing, and to look for that and to hold that close in your heart. So our personal interpretation on it can appear like we're separate. And if we start to tell our personal interpretation of what's happening, we'll dig ourselves a hole into more separation. So, and it will just reinforce more illusion when we start to really tell our stories and our narratives and our beliefs about something. So we just want to stay with the feeling of what's happening, and to integrate the things that separate us from oneness. The things that separate us from oneness are, well, they cut us off from the experience of oneness, are the ancient imprints within us. They will be opening that gap. And when we integrate and we allow ourselves to feel them, then they'll be closing the gap. So our mission here, I believe, is to dissolve whatever barriers there are between us and presence, us and love, whatever we want. We're in a process of dissolving all of the things that we're placing in the gap and placing more value on than the presence that's there. And we can get really taken in by some of our old ancient imprints and some of the significance we put on that, so we can get taken out for a while. But we're coming back and really just choosing to put our value on the shared presence. That's where we start to get support from life to keep showing up and showing us how this is so. So the more that we look for it, the more that we deliberately choose it, the more that we'll start to engage and be a part of it and feel part of it. So the stuff that we have between us and us, the cup, the pen, the different things that are between us in the gap, we can choose how we're going to interact with our reality. We can choose to close the gap or open the gap. We can use a pen and we can write something horrible, or we can write our appreciation for how we're noticing shared presence. We can choose with people, we can choose with circumstances, whether we're going to close the gap or open the gap. And really our life is really a journey of, are we opening the gap or closing the gap? If we, there's two types of witness as well, I believe. He doesn't talk so much about this, but we have our internal witness that's observing, and that's already just great that we're observing what's happening in our life. But on the other side of the gap, beyond our internal witness, is the eternal witness of all things, the big witness, the Buddha consciousness, the one consciousness. And that's where we want to place our attention. And in that place, there's only one of us. And in that place, we are of course, always receiving what we need, because it's intelligent and it's us. So of course, life is bringing us exactly what's right. Of course, life is unfolding every moment in a beautiful orchestration, even though it can feel like there's lots of dud notes or out of key notes sometimes. That's just what life is bringing us for integration. So when we're in time and space, we are in all the narrative, we're making stories up about all the charges, we're blaming, we're complaining, we're judging, we're resisting. That's when we've got back into time and space, and that's when with the gap, we've opened the gap. And when we take a moment to integrate the feelings, to be with them, to hold them, to know that they're just ancient imprints that are moving through us, that are limiting us from the truth. We allow ourselves to fully digest them, to let them move through. Now we're responding to life. And then we start to close the gap, and then we can start to have moments of feeling that interconnectivity, that everything is part of everything else. So, what we can do is when, we're on this path is we can think, okay, everything's divine, everything's one, but not that, definitely not that, and definitely not that, and definitely not this feeling, and, and everything else, but definitely not, my boss or whatever it is. We start to want to place our limitations on it, because that annoying person is, we want to wrestle to the ground, and then everything else is divine, or, so we just want to notice, is that worth, is it worth us? Is that story really worth us losing the truth for? And, just doing the best we can to allow ourselves to clear and integrate what we know is coming up for our benefit, even though it's really gnarly often and annoying and painful, but we know it's coming up for our benefit, so that we can be part of more presence and enjoy really feeling being a part of life, not, and working with a knowing field, working and being and living and breathing and experiencing life as a knowing field. These are the opportunities, and we have choices, when we talk to people, we have choices when we meet people. He does the grocery example this week of when we're buying items, we can just keep staring at the items and putting them and just ignoring the checkout person and just getting our groceries and going home and just being lost in time and space. Or we can take a moment to ignite presence in someone else, because we realize the same presence in us is the same presence in them looking back. And as we remember the unified presence, we remind that person, and then we reinforce it in ourselves. And it can be as simple as, how's your day? How are you doing today? That question is closing the gap, and we have that opportunity. Yeah. So I think that is all I'm going to share. I think the work is stretching our capacity for what we'll allow in as the one unified consciousness. We're just stretching. We might close and stretch, and we might close and stretch, but we're stretching our capacity for allowing in the one presence, the shared presence. And our attention on it and our focusing on it will bring more of it to us. And this is a good thing. Do we want to focus on all our neurotic old stories, or do we want to focus on this incredible field that's intelligent and alive and awake and loving and supportive and part of everything? So that is all I'm going to share for now. I'm going to press stop recording.